My guest, Shem Malmquist, is a pilot who's going to be talking about airline safety and the effects of 5G in airports. So join us in 5 minutes. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing tonight? Boy, the weather's been wicked, hasn't it? Really weird weather. All sunny here. In the middle of it all, hail. Hail and rain, and then gone, all sunny again, and then hail and rain. We're supposed to have thunderstorms tonight. I don't know, man. The spring weather, something to behold. I was out mowing yesterday. I was out cleaning my yard, mowing my lawns, and weeding and all that stuff. Had to bring in my lawnmower and my weed eater and everything. Everything got wet. Didn't expect it to. Anyway, my name is Charlotte. I'll be your host for the next hour. Welcome to California Haunts Radio. I am also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team, based out of Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state of California. So that means that if you have what you think is a paranormal problem, give us a ring, shoot me an email at the radio station, at the radio website, and we'll get out to help you, because we're nearly in every county in California. Well, not to add to, and also to add to that, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii. So we're around. Anyway, I want to welcome everybody here tonight. We've got a great show. It's a different show. Like I tell you guys, I like to mix it up a little bit with, paranormal stuff, and then real news, stuff that means stuff to people. And I think this is a topic that means stuff to people. Airline safety, we all, almost all of us travel via airplanes. I've been very fortunate. I've been to Europe 3 times. I've been cross country dozens of times. And I've been very fortunate. My dad used to be one that traveled at least once a month via airline, and so he was real fortunate. He said he had a few interesting trips on planes. I know I did. The last time I went back east, it was April, middle of snowstorms. So I had my share of interesting moments, landing in Chicago. So I could say that. But it's nothing my dad didn't tell me about. So I was pretty prepared. My friend was sitting next to me, and I said, "Uh-oh." I could see the reflection of the plane's landing lights on the runway. It's icy out there. But anyway, if you're watching from YouTube and you're new, please subscribe. There's a little ghost down there in the bottom right-hand corner with the magnifying glass and a Sherlock Holmes hat on. We have almost 250 videos over there of varying topics. As you can see tonight, is a different type of topic for us. But yeah, please subscribe. We're looking for subscribers. Visit our website at californiahauntsradio.com. In fact, we're going out live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and the California Haunts Radio website right now. Which is kind of cool, too. But anyway, I want to welcome everybody here. And our guest is a pilot. He also does other stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and let him explain that, because you know how I am about that. Mr. Shem Malmquist. And I think he has a lot to say about airline safety. He's written a book about one crash that we can also talk about, and also 5G. There's a lot of talk about 5G around airports and stuff, how that's affecting planes and communication. All right. Anyway, let me bring him on. Hello, sir.
Hey, good evening.
Good evening.
Can you hear me all right?
I actually have a cousin who flies for United.
Okay.
Yes. We got a bit of a delay here.
Pilot or cabin crew?
He's a pilot.
Okay. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, there's a few thousand around the world. I guess I don't know what the total number is, honestly, but there's a few. So yeah, it's been interesting. I've been flying since I guess since 1976 is when I first started flying. So it's been a little while. But flying around the world since 1987. So it's been an interesting time. So I guess by way of background, I heard you say a little bit about me, and I am currently a Boeing 777 captain, and generally go literally around the world about 1 or 2 times a month. Uh, in addition, I am a full-time faculty and professor teaching aviation safety at Florida Tech, Florida Institute of Technology, and I'm involved with a number of different safety, uh, a lot of different safety initiatives, a lot of different industry organizations, a lot of industry work over the years. So I've been involved, I guess, most of my life at this point. I'm originally from California, also, actually. So thinking about the weather out there, which I definitely prefer most of the year. There's a couple months where it's okay.
Absolutely. So tell me, what's it like? I mean, I used to fly ultralights when I was younger, and I know what you fly is nothing like an ultralight. So what's it like to be in the cockpit of these planes, because there's just so much instrumentation?
Well, I don't think, I mean, there's really, at this point, honestly, less instrumentation than there was when I first started, because with the automation and the computers, we're actually displaying quite a bit less on the instruments, which is a good and bad thing in some respects. Of course, the information that is normally important is what's displayed and what's up front. But on the other hand, we are constrained by what somebody sitting in an office or a cubicle imagine what we would need under a certain phase of flight. And that can create issues. In fact, it does create issues at times. So that's a whole other interesting area that I've been working on, involved with the with safety and how to design future aircraft. And it really does matter in terms of the pilot needs to have the ability to control the aircraft and control the environment.
Hmm.
But also, in order to do that, you actually have to have really accurate feedback. You have to be able to know what's actually happening and not just a representation of what's happening. You really need to be connected to the real world in order to be able to make the correct judgments and decisions. So it's interesting, and these are some challenges going forward in terms of automation and the use of computers in not just aircraft, but really any kind of system that
It,
we are adding software into.
it sounds like the argument that the Gemini astronauts had initially, because they didn't want to have that whole thing controlled by a computer, because they wanted to be able to take over if something went wrong.
Yes, you need to be able to control the environment. It doesn't mean that a computer is not a really useful tool for controlling it
Hmm.
all the time or a big part of the time. But in the end, you want the computer or the human to be the final arbiter of what happens and what is safe or what isn't.
Hmm.
For example, a computer is dependent on the information that you've hooked it up to and what it can receive. It does not have the ability to look out the window and say, that sensor data is inaccurate.
Hmm.
And because of that, it can make the wrong decisions. And if the pilot is being fed the exact same information, of course, that's a problem.
Right.
But in the end, a human has abilities that computers, uh, I won't say never have, but there's no computer out there that can really match what humans can do at this point.
Hmm. Hmm.
They can replicate certain things, and in those things that they can replicate, they can often do a better job. But those are limited to the scenarios that were envisioned in the design itself. And if the person who is designing the software could not envision it, or didn't imagine it, or didn't design for that particular scenario, the computer simply can't handle that. Whereas, of course, a human is able to adapt
Mhm.
and work outside of that kind of framework if we give them the tools to do it, which of course is a caveat.
What I was just thinking when you were saying that was Eastern Flight 401, the misbalance with the autopilots.
When they were of course focused on a light,
Right. But wasn't
and
it a case where the guy that was actually flying the plane saw the readings different, or
wait,
saw the readings as they were supposed to be once the autopilot was disengaged?
I think that's very, very common. In fact, a lot of accidents, not just aircraft accidents, but
Mhm.
accidents in general are caused by essentially what you're describing as confirmation bias.
Mhm.
When you make up your mind about what you see occurring and or what you're perceiving,
Mhm.
and then you start excluding information that goes against that and seeking out information that confirms it. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a really serious problem, and I mean, frankly, we're seeing it in the political sphere. It's a huge issue,
Mhm.
and it leads people to be really, really sure of a position because they are not accepting information that might be outside of what their paradigm is.
Mhm.
Of course,
Mhm.
for a pilot, it could be deadly. Or any, I mean, it's not just pilot though. I mean, it's somebody who's running any kind of complex scenario where decisions are critical.
Mhm.
Definitely very risky for in the medical profession.
Mhm.
And we do, of course, have a really, really high medical error rate in the United States. But in those cases, there's only one person dying at a time. So I suppose it's not as newsworthy unless it's somebody famous. So
Well,
there's
look,
that.
look at these Tesla cars that drive themselves.
Yeah, they don't really drive themselves. Really, they are a very good example of what not to do with automation.
Yes.
They are, um, I mean, it's really an amazingly poor understanding of how humans act, what humans' roles are in the system, what computers are capable of, and what they're not capable of. Uh, really bad and very flawed assumptions. I mean, the electric vehicle is great, but having the computer control and the automation is really problematic. In terms of automotive companies, probably the company that well, there's a few companies that really have it down and really have nailed this concept between the balance between automation and providing the human with the control, but using the automation to keep the human within boundaries that they don't accidentally go off and cause an accident.
Mhm.
Volvo is a good example of a company that's extremely good at that,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, where there's never a time where the computer even feels like it's ceding control or taking control, and so the driver never would feel like they can relax their guard. But if the person gets distracted and it starts going off track, the car intervenes.
Mhm.
It's really probably one of the best uses I've seen.
Mhm.
There's some couple other companies that do very similar things, but it really is well designed and well thought out in terms of that.
Absolutely. Well, when you talk about airline, when you think about airline safety, I mean, everybody, not everybody's concerned. I used to love to fly. I was never afraid. I would get on airplanes and the takeoff, the landing, the whole thing. I love the whole thing. But I know people who don't even want to step foot on a plane because they're reading all this stuff in the newspapers all the time. I mean, how concerned do people have to be?
Well, I don't think that they need to be all that concerned. What happens with that is just that's what they call availability cascade or availability heuristic. When people are exposed to a lot of information, they start to kind of see it everywhere. Uh, I mean, we have it manifests in certain ways. For example, you buy a certain type of car, and all of a sudden you see that car all over the roads where you didn't
Mhm.
even notice it before. But we see it Like some really easy examples. People on the East Coast are really afraid of earthquakes. I mean, growing up in California,
Right.
it was like the only concern with them is, okay, how strong was that? Really, you're very relaxed about it.
Hmm.
Uh, with exceptions. I mean, that there's boundaries, but at the same time, people from other parts of the country outside of Florida are really afraid of hurricanes. And the Floridians are out having hurricane parties. Oh, it's a great opportunity. Let's buy some liquor. We're going to hole up. Um, Tornadoes are like that in the Midwest, where people are afraid of those.
Right.
Um, you know, People worried about, for example, Islamic terrorism, or afraid of going to certain parts of Paris, which is, you know, arguably safer than any city in the United States. And I think that part of that is what you're exposed to and things that exacerbate your fear. Shark attacks are another one, of
Hmm.
course. But meanwhile, surfers are out there all the time. But Midwesterner is going to be afraid of them probably. So part of it is just what we're exposed to. Air travel remains extremely safe. Um, for a comparable trip, it's always going to be safer. So
Hmm.
it's not that, getting in the car to go to the grocery store is more dangerous than getting in an airplane. That's just silly. But getting in a car and driving to New York, your exposure there is going to be magnitudes higher than on an aircraft. And we've managed to make flying incredibly safe. And when you think about it, it's actually kind of amazing that we've done that. And it has to do with a few ways the industry approaches risk. It, in general, serves it very well that the industry moves very, very slowly. It's very conservative about making changes, and so that really mitigates a lot of the problems. And of course, having pilots on board that are have a self interest of self preservation, uh, and even if they're not worried about you know, getting in an accident, they're worried about getting violated or losing their ability to earn a living. So that actually might be, in some cases, a more powerful incentive, interestingly enough. It's um, but it's generally a very safe thing. And I should caveat the reason why the risk of the like certificate action probably is higher in a lot of pilots' minds is that pilots are very, very low on what you would call the neuroticism scale. So they tend to be not very sensitive to threat or worried about threat, which you need that personality type in order to be able to not, not get worked up if you have bad weather or you have some kind of some kind of issue. It's what allows people to remain calm.
Hmm.
But at the same time, it I think in certain venues it could lead people to doing things that would be more risky in other endeavors. So flying is kept safe because the pilots are uh, cautious. You have more than one person, and it's a very, very controlled environment. I don't know that the people would necessarily not take risks if they didn't feel that anything else was at risk, but that's a whole different environment.
Right. 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 And then, I was thinking too, when there is a crash, doesn't the FAA really look at? I mean, they look at every component on that airplane to see what caused that crash. I mean, they're going through there, with a fine tooth comb,
Well, it's actually the National Transportation
or
Safety Board
whoever it is. Yeah. Yeah.
days, or the equivalent agencies around the
Okay.
world.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean, the whole point of the accident investigation is to identify problems, identify areas of risk, and make recommendations to try to prevent future accidents. So it's a little bit, well, what other industries do have this, but aviation has also been aided by really opening up, having
Hmm.
a very strong reporting culture, um, making sure that people are aware of what's going on and hopefully not covering up any kinds of problems, which is actually a huge problem, for example, in the medical industry, where people tend to cover things up, more worried about liability, where in the airline industry, self-reporting and reporting problems or deviations is encouraged and expected, and people are never held, they're not in trouble for ever reporting any kind of problem or deviation unless they were intentionally and willfully violating rules and creating a unnecessary risk, which goes back to what I was saying before, is that pilots are going to be, in my experience, pilots are probably more concerned about getting violated than having an accident. And of course, if you're careful and you're staying within the bounds where you won't get violated, you won't have an accident either. So it works out well. But as far as fear factor, and I should also say that part of that is because, everyone feels like they're invulnerable to a certain extent. So their vulnerability to an accident, they feel like it won't happen to them. And that's typically true. So if we keep in with the other bounds, and hopefully then we'll stay safe. And a lot of the education that we're doing now is getting people to try to accept that that an accident can happen to even very good pilots, and that's been actually fairly effective too in the last few years. But that's been more challenged to overcome, just because people's prevailing attitudes is just like 90% of drivers think that they're in the top, or that over 50% of drivers think they're in the top 90%. We always think that we're better or invulnerable to any kind of risk or problem. So that's kind of a separate issue. But in cars, you have no control over other drivers, and of course, people generally aren't as good as they think they are, and we get distracted easily, and we have a lot of distractions because of things like cell phones, things like that really should not be taking place in an airplane, and in my experience do not. So that makes a big difference as well.
That's a good thing to bring up too for people. They always tell you to turn off your cell phones. What does a cell phone do to an airplane?
Well, the cell phone itself, so this 5G thing is kind of newer. There have been cases of the transmission of even though the signal is weak, from a phone or even an FM radio type of receiver that can actually emit some signals, because the wires are so long, they are very, very sensitive to very weak signals. And so you can get an errant signal where something is picked up just because somebody is transmitting nearby. And so that's part of it. That has been mitigated a bit in more recent years, but it is still potentially there. Now, the 5G has added another dimension, and we'll see how it pans out. So far, things have been pretty good, and we haven't seen any problems that I'm aware of. But 5G, has the problem with 5G is that it's very close to the frequency range that is designated for aircraft radio altimeters. And aircraft radio altimeters are on a band that was chosen because nothing was close to it. And so the receivers for radio altimeters are not designed to very, very finely discriminate against other transmissions that are fairly close by, just because it was assumed nothing would get close to it. However, because of primarily some mistaken choices by a couple of the larger cell phone providers, they find that they need to encroach on that bandwidth, and they purchased it from the FCC over the objections of the FAA, actually, and other people in the industry at the time. This was known, but there were, I think, people in position high up at some of these organizations that overruled those objections. It's a whole story unto itself, I think, politically, back in 2018 or so, 2017. And these signals, because they can transmit near the radio altimeter signal, have the potential to interfere with a number of onboard aircraft systems. That includes not just the simple things. For example, we use the radio altimeter to aid in even a manual landing on the larger wide bodies, where it's much more challenging to get an accurate idea of your height above the ground because you're so high up when you're landing. But in addition, it interferes with the autopilot functioning, auto throttles, which are designed to have different modes at different phases of flight and do different things when you're near the ground as opposed to higher up, can be fooled into doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. There are landing awareness systems, terrain awareness systems, ground proximity warning systems. On the fly-by-wire airplanes, there's a landing flare augmentation systems. All of these can interact in unexpected ways, and we just don't know exactly how it will interact. So to a certain extent, the industry is very cautious, and we don't want to take any chances. Is it going to manifest into a real risk? Well, the problem is that you don't know until it's too late, and it will occur when you have a combination of factors that make it, by definition, a rare event. And the longer we go without it, the more confidence there is that it's not a problem, and the less guard there is to protect against a potential problem. And you can have a situation where all of a sudden you run into something that nobody has been trained for, and really creates a surprisingly bad situation. So that's really, I think, where things are right now. Europe and some of the other countries limited the bandwidth, limited where these antennas could be, limited the strength, designed the antenna so it's not pointing upward where it can affect aircraft. They took a number of measures that just did not happen in the United States. So it's a potential out there. So far, knock on wood, it hasn't been. And, it's one of those, it could be just a really rare event. If it's something that happens once every 10,000 hours, then we might not see it. Even by probability, we could go 10 years and not see it, then all of a sudden see a problem. There's just no way to know at this point, and that's the problem.
Absolutely. What about put when you're on board to put your phone in airplane mode? Does that do anything? I mean, does that do anything to the phone or anything like that, or is that can that still potentially affect the airplane?
No, when it's in airplane mode, it's now only going to be limited to the Wi-Fi that the airplane has, assuming if the airplane's equipped, and that's been pretty well tested on the aircraft. The problem with not being in airplane mode is just that it hasn't been tested. It's not that it necessarily would be a problem, but you would have to go out, take all these different kinds of cell phones that are constantly changing power and types of signal and different designs, whether it's the latest Samsung or Apple product or Motorola or whatever they are, and you have to test all of them. Otherwise, you can't say it'll work. Or you can't say it's safe. And that's really where the problem is. So it's not that some systems aren't safe, and some test systems have even been tested to ensure that they are for a lot of different flight modes, but it just becomes impossible to test every single one of these, and that's where the problem comes up. It's just too much.
And I know this is done on every flight, but why is it requested that the no smoking sign go off when you guys are getting ready to land and take off?
Well, no, as far as smoking, smoking has pretty much been banned on every
Right,
airline
right,
around the
right.
world for a number
My
of
bad.
years. Um,
I
so
haven't flown in a while, so
yeah, no, we don't really. Uh, I don't think there's any airline that allows smoking anymore. But I mean, really, just fire danger was always a risk of it, and still is. A in-flight fire is one of the worst possible things that can happen. You can't pull over. You're and fires can burn and progress very rapidly, and
mhm.
you can end up with a really bad situation very quickly. And there's been several accidents because of in-flight fires. So that's really the issue with cigarettes, and apart from that, of course, they really the nicotine really created a lot of issues for maintenance and for aircraft systems. It's pretty amazing. I mean, literally, they would have tar dripping out of the certain components back in
Ew.
those days. It's really disgusting. Yeah, it's
Well, I can imagine because I mean, plus everything's on. That's all that recirculated air going through there, and oh my gosh,
yeah. I mean, it's going through the newer airplanes through really
right.
good HEPA filters, and but then the air is still changing out pretty quickly, but it goes overboard through outflow valves, and those were getting coated with tar back in those days. So
Hmm.
that's been no smoking has happened for really a long time now, so it's really not an issue.
As a pilot, what do you think the most difficult part of your job is?
Oh, that's a good question. That as long as everything is working, there's not that flying the airplane is fairly straightforward. Probably one of the biggest challenges right now, I think, in general, is that um, the system has gotten so reliable that it has become more challenging for pilots to maintain the skill sets to be able to manage the off nominal conditions. And that is an ongoing issue. And it's exacerbated because in training, we tend to train for those things that we have seen happen
Hmm.
that seem statistically likely, but the events that kill people are the things that are not likely and haven't happened. And traditionally, the way pilots receive skill and training for those was through experience.
Hmm.
But now you can have pilots that are extremely experienced, um, that have not really experienced anything, any kind of unusual situation in their career. So providing ways to get that training is definitely a challenge. Other than that, the busy phases, just getting ready before departure. A big part of flying is the planning, staying ahead of it, and that that's probably the by far the biggest part. And then the busiest phases are pre-departure through initial departure, and then uh, during the arrival when there's a lot more dynamic changes and things that can happen. So it's so those are tend to be busier, but very manageable because people are so highly trained. So it makes it so they're not problematic or anything like that. Other areas are more gray,
Hmm.
weather avoidance, uh, learning how to identify convective or thunderstorms, uh, landing on icy conditions, things of that nature. Definitely can add more challenge, and people have to be more careful. And those are other areas where training is extremely important to make sure that people are doing it right and following the rules. And so I'd say that's probably some of the more challenging areas. Some of the others would have to do with complex decision making. Uh, for example, an aircraft is flying up an airway that until a couple years ago that we always took over through Iranian airspace.
Hmm.
If you're on that type of leg and encounter have some type of problem, do you want to divert, for example, to Tehran with the political situation, or is it better to continue to a more distant point? Balancing those risks and making that kind of decision is more challenging, and it's also very much the kind of decision a computer really has no way of making, because these are really subjective problems. How do you program a computer to be able to look at the exact scenario, the exact situation that you have, weather conditions at various points, and for example, looking at the crew or also passengers and considering what passports those people have, things like that, that can create a huge mess depending on what country you go to.
Hmm.
So those kinds of things are definitely a challenging kind of decision that fortunately don't come up very often, but require that human ingenuity to be able to solve.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you wrote a book about an airline crash, correct?
A couple books, yeah. I've got there's this one, which see if I can move it up. So
Got it
this
right here.
one I wrote it with Roger Rappaport. This is Angle of Attack,
There
which
we
is
go.
about that's good, which is about the Air France 447 accident. And then more recently, we did a book, Grounded, which I don't know if you're grabbing it or you probably just had an image of
There
it.
we
But
go.
this is the other one more recently, which was on the really more about the Boeing Max and some of the problems that are involved with the implementation of software in these systems. So yeah, we had to write a book to make sure we got both Airbus and Boeing mad at us. So that was good. We accomplished that. So we consider that's a job well done. The but in the end, we didn't really, I guess, criticize the companies as much,
Hmm.
and more just sought to understand how the scenarios happen, what transpired to put the design in those conditions, and what kind of decisions were being made uh, all along the way. But one thing is very clear, when I look at accidents over the last 25 or 30 years, we're really not seeing pilot error as being a factor, although it's being listed as a factor.
Hmm.
It's really due to various biases that happen during the investigation phase. I would say almost more than anything else, and biases that we have in terms of causality,
Hmm.
where we tend to look at everything as a sequence of events. We tend to use something called reliability theory, where we are looking at every component and the failure rates, including considering humans in that role. And when you use some of those more simplistic models, it's very easy just to end up and land on the human as the cause of most accidents, where what we are really seeing is the human being a necessary and vital component of the um, overall system design, where the expectation is that the human will manage those scenarios that the engineers could not envision in advance. And sometimes we put people in situations that are just too complicated and they are not able to manage it. And that is, when that happens, we call that an error,
Hmm.
where really we just designed a system that was way too brittle, and we expected too much of humans. People are not going to react the same way every single time. In fact, we do not want them to.
Mhm.
It's the whole advantage of them. But if we're expecting them to behave like a computer and work in a scripted way every time, and then you design your system around that expectation, it's not going to work out well.
Right.
You make some really bad assumptions.
Right. What happened in the case, for nobody that's read the book, what happened in the Air France case?
Well, there was a lot of different, a lot to it, really. Let me get more water. Water turns out to be really, excuse me, really important. So, in the, excuse me, I seem to have got something, something in my throat. Sorry. Excuse me. I don't know what's going on. But in the Air France case, the pilots departed Rio de Janeiro in the evening, which most flights from the from the Americas depart in the late afternoon, early evening, going when they're going to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty typical. And that's how the schedules are worked out and balanced. They had spent a couple days. They had, I think, a 2-day layover, as I recall, and then they were flying up to Paris. And on departure, a pretty standard, uh, typical day, crew of 3 pilots, due to the flight length being a bit over 8 hours. And so they did what is pretty typical. They have a captain, a first officer, and then a relief pilot. And the relief pilot normally is for most airlines, we're using first officers as a relief pilot. But in these kinds of flights, both the first officer or co-pilot as well as the relief pilots are fully qualified and type rated in the aircraft, so they legally could operate as captain. So they take off, and the first thing that happens is normally the relief pilot takes the first rest, and the reason is because on an evening departure nobody is tired yet, and so you don't want the captain trying to sleep and not get any sleep for the flight.
Mm-hmm.
And the same with the first officer. And so the relief pilot sleeping first comes up. He didn't get that much sleep, but he's not really that tired yet either, or he shouldn't be, I don't expect. So he comes up to relieve the captain. The captains usually take the middle rest period on those kinds of flights. And the reason for that is because the last thing you want to do is be sleeping right before you start your descent, and then try to wake up all groggy and figure out what's going on for the most work intensive part of the flight, which is the arrival planning and descending into the country. So the captain is taking the second rest. They have some weather in the area, which is pretty typical. For crossing the tropics, it's basically a constant that there will be thunderstorms. And the captain goes to the back to get ready to sleep. They have a designated crew rest area on the aircraft, and he's back just a couple of minutes when the crew, the 2 first officers or co-pilots who are sitting in front, see that they're encountering or coming up on some weather. And it doesn't take that long when you're traveling 8 miles a minute. So they see this weather in front of them. I should also say that both of these co-pilots are actually really highly experienced. They both had flown aerobatics. They both flew gliders. They had a lot of flying, really a relatively large amount of flying time. Really good records, had a very, very good reputation. And so they see some weather, and they start trying to deviate around it. One of the issues that came up at this time is that the way that weather is been historically trained as far as thunderstorm avoidance using the onboard aircraft weather radar is really a bit inadequate. So they turn into what they think is a thinner area where there's less weather, but it turns out to be an area where they encounter these high altitude ice crystals. And these high altitude ice crystals, fairly rare phenomena, and people knew they were out there, but in this case, the size of these ice crystals is larger than what had been assumed would be possible by the aircraft designers. And this very quickly overwhelms their pitot tubes that are used to measure the ram air pressure so you can measure your speed. So they lose all indication of speed. And the problem is that on these kinds of aircraft, there's no way to recognize or know what speed you're going if you've lost that kind of sense. There's not a difference in sound. You don't have any outside speed reference. There is, really just no, and there's no feedback on the controls or anything like that to tell you that you're going faster or slower. So the crew is really not knowing what is happening. And the same is also true for the flight control computers that also have lost their sensors from the same thing. And so it loses its ability to basically control its environment in a normal way, and it degrades to a degraded form of flight control logic. The simultaneous to a few other factors going on, they're also in turbulence in the top of a thunderstorm. They ended up climbing without really realizing it entirely, getting slow, and the aircraft encounters what we call an aerodynamic stall, where it loses lift over the wings. The problem here is that although pilots are trained to identify aerodynamic stalls in both simulators and in lighter aircraft at lower altitude, the way a aerodynamic stall manifests at cruise altitude in a large aircraft is completely different. And our simulators, even though we've improved the models, are just not able to they're just flat out not able to manage that. And so what happens is that a real stall feels a lot different than anything they've encountered. And so people don't recognize the stall. They don't realize what's happening. And in this case, very quickly, they start losing altitude very quickly, even though they seem to be at a reasonably nominal pitch attitude and they have a lot of power. They start trying to call the captain up. The captain is, we don't know exactly where he was, but he's only been back a couple of minutes. And based on my experience, I think that he was where any normal person would be when you're getting ready to lie down and go to sleep. He's in the lab, changing and using the lab before he tries to sleep for a couple hours. So when they're ringing a chime trying to bring him forward, he's not hearing it because he's not in the crew rest area. It would make no sense for him to be in the crew rest area that quickly. So at that point, they're descending. They don't know what's going on. The captain finally comes up. He has no awareness of what's going on. Of course, he didn't see any of the history of it. And they continue down without realizing what's happening. And a lot of this goes back to some of the problems that I mentioned earlier with lack of feedback. They really had no way to know what the state of the aircraft was. And so they ended up hitting the water. A lot of different factors that led up to that. And of course, it have to do with design decisions and decisions between the airline. And unfortunately, most of the issues are pretty pervasive across the industry. It's an interesting accident in that everybody from from Airbus, the air designer of the aircraft, Air France, the pilots, everybody was actually doing what they were supposed to do, which is what we're seeing on most of these accidents. We're seeing accidents where everything is doing everybody does what they're supposed to do, and the system works exactly as designed. And the MCAS was another example of that. The system worked exactly as designed, did what it was supposed to do based on the design. The pilots reacted in the way that, basically the way that they were actually trained, although what they were actually trained for was different than what the assumptions of what they were trained for by Boeing in the design phase. So you have a disconnect there, but it's not that everybody wasn't trying to do the right thing. It's complex, but accidents are not occurring for the reasons that people think they are. I would say very simply, but occurring in other areas, but in ways that we actually can mitigate and solve them by using better hazard analysis methods. One of the best coming out of MIT by Dr. Nancy Leveson, where she has really developed some extremely robust hazard analysis methods that are able to manage extremely complex systems and identify hazards in these kinds of systems and flaws and assumptions. So that's been a big focus of a lot of my other work, is implementing some of those concepts that have come out of Dr. Leveson's work.
Now, my question is this: wouldn't it be better? I mean, like you say, a lot of this stuff is designed by computer engineers, these processes. Wouldn't it be better if they actually worked with the pilots themselves to come up with this stuff?
Well, you would think so. I mean, Boeing did, actually. The problem with using pilots in that way is that pilots tend to be very confident and don't necessarily know what they don't know when it comes to this kind of problem. Very good in their own area, but and certainly have very strong ideas of design. But if you take, like I'll give you an example with weather radar. There's one of the radar manufacturers that designed a system that has an algorithm to detect thunderstorms that is idealized for flying over North America and using techniques that most pilots use. The problem is that the assumptions for how thunderstorms form and manifest themselves is only valid for North America. Other parts of the world, thunderstorms are entirely different. Where the water is in the storm is different. Where they reflect from radar is different. And so if you apply that kind of concept using pilots and saying, "Oh, we use pilots as our guidance," it's wrong. Just because they weren't really the experts that they thought they were. They didn't have the same kind of experience. Part of the problem with pilots in a flight test environment, or first of all, flight test pilots are test pilots for a reason. They're not average pilots. So you just start with that. And then even if you were to pull other pilots into the system that are not technically test pilots, you're not forcing people or taking random pilots. You are using people that are either hired or have volunteered to do that task. And the kind of pilots that do that or are involved with that also are not typical pilots. They're much more closer to the test pilots in terms of knowledge and skills. And so the assumptions that they would make on what other people know or understand is going to be based on their own experience and what they know. And that is not necessarily the same of what's really happening in terms of an average, real average person out there. So using pilots by itself is not enough. applying some methods of hazard analysis that capture more complex scenarios is a more powerful way to go. And it's not that pilots shouldn't be part of the process or people like that who are subject matter experts, but if you start with a scenario and can generate the scenarios and then ask the pilots or subject matter experts if that is a plausible scenario, now you've presented them with an idea that maybe they haven't thought of, and they're like, oh wait, that could happen, and they're going to see it, but they're not likely to identify problems that they have not seen before. And most people aren't. I mean, we're just not trained to do that. And most of our methods of trying to guess what kind of hazards are out there are just based on our own experience. And we really just kind of brainstorm it and we think of what might be possible. There's not a formal method to do that. Or the formal methods are limited to the that reliability theory that I was talking about before, which by definition constrains things, whereas the system theory that Dr. Levison has created allows us to extrapolate into the system design and look at the interaction between all of the components in the socio-technical system, where some of the other methods really just work for the physical components, and then there's a lot of psychology to work with the human component, but they are not really connected. And there's limitations also in that the engineers do not really understand the human factors, and the human factors people don't really understand engineering, and so you have gaps there as well. So that's why a method that captures both is definitely more powerful.
It does sound, you're right, absolutely. What do you have to say to people that are afraid to fly?
Well, I mean, people are afraid of a lot of, I mean, some people are afraid to go in the ocean because there's sharks.
Right.
So, I mean, you'd say the same kind of thing, so you could, I don't think that just telling people statistics is enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, People are going to be afraid of things that they feel that they can't control. And so it really, I think, is more of a control thing and almost more than anything else. But I would say that I mean, I think flying is um, extremely safe. I don't hesitate to ride in the back as a passenger.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that our pilots, our cabin crew, the support staff, people are really, really doing a good job. And so the people who are on board have the ability to adjust their behavior so we end up where you want to go. One analogy I've used is it's similar to actors in a play where you might have somebody forget their lines, you might have a prop that doesn't work or part of the set gets stuck, but the actors know where the play needs to end up. And so they are going to adjust their performance and their, where they are and what they say in order to have the whole play end as it should, even in spite of that, let's say part of the set being literally stuck in the middle of the stage. And pilots are really working in a very similar way. They are adjusting their performance, and not just pilots, of course. You have air traffic controllers, you have cabin crew, um, aircraft maintenance, dispatchers, all these support people that are literally adjusting their performance uh, in order to make sure that we end up at the end state. And they're very, very good at it. And that is literally what the job is and what they're getting paid for. So, if somebody is afraid of it anyway, I mean, it's not different than telling somebody from the Midwest is afraid to come to California because there's earthquakes. I mean, what can you say? It's an irrational fear to a certain extent, right? Just they have to experience it, and then hopefully they relax over time.
Let me ask you one more question here. I'm curious because you do fly a big jet. You
Right.
know, what differentiates some pilots who are allowed to fly the big jets as opposed? Well, I mean they're all big, but you know what I mean. Somebody who can fly the jumbo jets as opposed to somebody who can fly the smaller jets.
um, well, first of all, it depends on whether the company that they are flying for
Hmm.
has the larger jets. I mean, like for example, Southwest doesn't, right? All
Right.
they have are relatively smaller jets.
Hmm.
Um, and then after that, primarily it is seniority. Uh, Airlines are based on the seniority system, and of course, pilots can make a choice. And occasionally, you have some people that prefer to stay on the smaller airplanes or flying shorter haul, but uh, generally the trips are a little bit better. The time off compensation, it's all a bit better um, on the bigger airplanes. For me, I find that I I actually get less rest if I was when I was flying domestic flights, particularly because I really don't like to wake up very early. But uh, if you had, it depends on the kind of person. Some people are morning people, but
Hmm.
I never have been very happy about getting up early in the morning and having to worry about setting an alarm and trying to go to sleep early enough to get enough sleep. It just never has been very effective. Whereas international crossing so many time zones, I seem to just sleep. But
Hmm.
everybody is different. But the seniority is a big part of it for the airlines. So if you take uh, American, Delta, United, etc., I mean, the people flying the bigger airplanes are normally more senior relatively, and with some exceptions. The first officer is not necessarily. I mean, that can vary a little bit more, but for the captains, almost always they are more senior. It's more pay. They've been with the company longer. It does create a situation where your most experienced pilots are flying the easiest trips, and there is an ongoing industry discussion because in some ways it would be nice to have people with more experience
Hmm.
dealing with flying in the upper Midwest in the middle of winter or the Northeast, but on balance, it seems to be working pretty well, and there's enough safety and extra margin put into the system that hasn't really been a problem, I guess, in general. But yeah, so anyway, to answer your question, it's seniority based would be the primary thing. There's not somebody who is flying a wide body airplane is not necessarily a better pilot. It's just that they've been with the company longer, and so they can do it.
Okay. So what's next for you, sir?
Well, I am working on a doctorate, and then I'll see what I want to do after that. Um, I plan to just continue working on aviation safety.
Hmm.
I think it's rewarding and interesting. Um, Promoting safety, promoting more work in the safety arena is it's just been very, very interesting, and not just in aviation and other fields as well.
Hmm.
The uh, the application of uh, Dr. Levison's methods it's been really, really fascinating, and we're really seeing some very, very good results. So that's really probably my focus, and will remain being, just because it's fun and interesting. Um,
That's,
I don't expect to be flying around the world indefinitely. I like being home. It turns out
there you go. There you
I
go.
appreciate it more.
So how can people find you?
Um, Probably, what's the easiest thing? I have a airline safety dot blog, which has my contact information. Um, of course, I'm available through the publisher of the books as well. And I am also, people find me also through Florida Tech, Florida Institute of Technology, through their website, through their publicity department there. And trying to think of people have found me through the National Transportation Safety Board, the Embry-Riddle University. I don't even know where some of the places. It seems like people find me in a lot of different places. So it just, yeah. And I don't always know where they do, but they seem to. But those would be the primary ways that I think people have reached me. That's probably the best.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I learned so much from you about it. I've always been curious about that stuff, and you cleared up a lot of my questions.
All right. Well, thank you, and enjoy your California evening.
Absolutely, my thunderstormy evening. See, I'm in thunderstorms today too, so
yeah,
you never know what's going to happen in May around here. All right, it's at some point we'd like to get you back on to talk about your next book and all that, and and
yeah, because he has a whole other. Well, it gets into some of the things that we've talked about anyway. So so that would be great.
All right, sir. Well, thank you very much. Have a good evening.
All right, you too. Good night.
All right, bye-bye. All righty, I did learn a lot. I mean, like I said, I used to fly. I don't want to say quite a bit, but quite a bit for me. And I know my dad used to fly quite a bit, and he would tell me about the different turbulence and all that. And he was even a person, he'd even get up there and go walk into the cockpit to see what was going on. That's how he was, So I learned quite a bit. Tomorrow, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're still off topic for paranormal, but I've got Honorable Judge Jim Gray coming on tomorrow, along with my good friend activist Henry Ortiz. They're going to be talking about jail conditions and how Honorable Gray, how Judge Gray, I'm going to say Jim Gray, how Judge Gray has been working behind the scenes, and since he's retired as well, to help find a way to better the jail conditions for incarcerated folks. So we're going to be talking about that tomorrow. Also, if you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you hated the show, share it with 5 people anyway. We're equal opportunity here at California Haunts Radio. And again, if you're watching from YouTube, please subscribe. The more the merrier. Click on that little ghost down the bottom right-hand corner with the magnifying glass and the Sherlock Holmes hat. And come visit our radio. Man, I'm just like all ahead of myself. Come visit our radio website at californiahauntsradio.com. In fact, this video went out live today, and you can go on there, and it's updated, and all our archives are there, so you can go month by month and check out our shows. If you don't want to go to YouTube, and sometimes people have trouble finding us on YouTube, so the best way to do it is to go to CaliforniaHauntsRadio.com. You see that ticker at the bottom? Well, that's there because California Haunts operates sort of as a nonprofit, to where we don't take anything to help people with their ghostly needs or anything else. So all the equipment, everything comes out of my pocket, as I'm the sole owner. And just like the radio show, I'm a retired journalist. This is what I do. And if something breaks, a computer, a camera, whatever breaks, it has to come out of my pocket. So I could use a little help to help pay the bills, pay the internet bills and things like that. So if you could help me out, that'd be great. PayPal.me at California Haunts. Or if you're uncomfortable with PayPal, there's Venmo at Venmo, and then type in California Haunts. I even have a Cash App under my own name. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming. I will show you his book and where to get his book. You can probably get the other book there as well. And then, like I said, I'll sign off for the night, and I will see you tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Pacific, so we can talk about jail conditions. So here we go. That would be Angle of Attack, Air France 447 in the Future of Aviation Safety. And that book is available at Amazon, and I believe his new book is also available at Amazon. And again, I want to thank you guys for coming, and I will see you tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Pacific. Here we go.